January 7th, 1944. Dawn bleeds slowly over northern France. Frost clings to the airfield tarmac as Luftwaffe ground crews hurry between parked Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Their breath fogs in the bitter cold, the silence of morning broken only by the groan of engines coming to life. Somewhere beyond the mist, the rumble of American bombers grows, steady, inevitable, like a storm that cannot be outrun. From his cockpit canopy, Oberleutnant Karl Neumann squints into the low sun, waiting for the silver silhouettes he's been warned about. New American escorts, they said. He expects the familiar slow-climbing Thunderbolts, easy targets when caught turning. But what rises from the glare is not what he imagined. The shapes are sharper, faster, sleeker, their wings flashing white as they soar straight into the sun itself, vanishing into blinding light before diving down again like falling stars. In the headset, voices crackle with disbelief. They're climbing straight up. In that instant, Neumann realizes something fundamental has changed. The sky, once the Luftwaffe's kingdom, no longer belongs to Germany. The war in the air is about to shift forever. By the winter of 1943, the sky above Europe had become the new front line of the Second World War. What began as daring dogfights over the Channel in 1940 had evolved into a vast and unrelenting struggle for control of the air, a struggle that determined not just who ruled the skies, but who would win the war itself. Germany's once proud Luftwaffe, the fearsome engine of blitzkrieg that had shattered Poland and France, now found itself strained to breaking. Years of constant sorties, dwindling fuel supplies, and the relentless loss of experienced pilots had begun to hollow its strength. Its airfields, once symbols of unstoppable conquest, became graveyards of twisted aluminum and scorched paint. Meanwhile, the United States had entered the war with a kind of industrial confidence Europe had never seen. American factories did not sleep. Conveyor belts turned through the night, producing bombers by the hour and fighters by the minute. Across the Atlantic, ships carried thousands of crated aircraft, brand new, gleaming, and hungry for the skies. But there was a flaw in America's early air strategy. The heavy B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators that bombed Germany could reach the heart of the Reich, but their escorts, short-range fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning, could not. Past a certain point over Europe, bombers flew alone, exposed to the teeth of the Luftwaffe's interceptors. The result was catastrophic. By late 1943, entire bomber formations were vanishing before they could even reach their targets. Over Bremen, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg, German flak and fighters turned daylight raids into massacres. Crews who survived told of skies blackened by smoke, of engines trailing fire, of comrades tumbling in slow motion through the air. American commanders called it the Black Autumn. The Luftwaffe, though battered, still had one great advantage: home turf. German pilots could take off, climb to altitude, attack, and land within hours. Their enemy, however, had to fly hundreds of miles, fighting fatigue, fuel limits, and the gnawing thought of not making it back. To the German high command, air supremacy seemed secure, for now. They believed no Allied fighter could fly from England to Berlin and back, let alone duel with the best German aces in between. But far across the ocean in a modest factory in Inglewood, California, engineers were building something quietly revolutionary. A machine designed not for defense, but for endurance. The aircraft was the North American P-51 Mustang. At first, it was an experiment, a British request for a faster fighter that could rival German designs. Yet its early versions, though agile, were underpowered. That changed when the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same heart that powered the Spitfire, was fitted into its frame. What emerged was not just a fighter, but a symbol of speed and reach the world had never known. The Mustang could climb higher, dive faster, and fly almost twice as far as any existing Allied escort. It could cross the Channel, fight deep into German territory, and still return home. It carried sleek lines that cut through the wind like a blade. Its arrival in the European theater in late 1943 was quiet at first, a few scattered squadrons testing tactics. But by early 1944, the P-51 was ready for full deployment. It was the answer to the Luftwaffe's dominance, and the weapon that would change everything. The Germans didn't know it yet, but the age of hunting bombers at will was over. From the frozen bases of East Anglia, groups like the 4th Fighter Group and the 357th Fighter Group began their missions. Little friends, as bomber crews affectionately called them. They would take off with the dawn, climb into the cold glare of morning, and vanish into sunlight. Silver against silver. Waiting for the hunters of the Reich. When they came, the hunters found something they had never faced before. Opponents who could meet them at equal height, equal speed, and for the first time, superior endurance. The balance of the war in the air was about to tilt, and every German pilot who strapped into his Messerschmitt in early 1944 was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The P-51 Mustang was not just another plane, it was a declaration that American industry and Allied persistence had finally turned the tide of innovation. And soon the skies over Europe would bear witness to that change, not through grand announcements or parades, but through the blinding flash of sunlight on polished wings, climbing where no German fighter dared to follow. By February 1944, rumors had already begun to circulate across German airfields, whispers of a new American fighter that could fly farther than any before it. Mechanics dismissed them as exaggeration. Officers called them propaganda. But to the young men who climbed into cockpits each dawn, rumors had a way of finding truth. The Luftwaffe's pilots were trained to expect the familiar rhythm of the air war, spot the bomber streams, climb above them, strike from the sun, and dive away before the escorts could react. That rhythm had defined their success for years. Yet as Allied raids pushed deeper into the Reich, something began to feel different. On the morning of February 20th, 1944, the first day of what would later be called Big Week, the difference became undeniable. Hundreds of B-17s crossed the North Sea, escorted by sleek silver fighters that didn't turn back near the Dutch coast as expected. They kept going, past Bremen, past Hanover, all the way toward Leipzig. From above the cloud line, German radar controllers watched with disbelief. These escorts didn't peel off. They stayed with the bombers, swarming like hawks over a flock of sheep. Langstreckenjäger. Long-range hunters, what a mature view. One officer muttered under his breath. The first squadrons to meet them were from Jagdgeschwader 26, veterans of the Channel Front. They were used to dueling Spitfires and Thunderbolts, confident in the Bf-109's agility. But when the Mustangs appeared, climbing almost vertically into the sun, everything changed. The P-51's Merlin engine gave it the perfect blend of speed and endurance. At 25,000 feet, where most engines gasped for oxygen, the Mustang still had power to climb. Its laminar flow wings reduced drag, giving it astonishing efficiency, and it could dive faster than nearly any German aircraft in service. One German ace, Major Heinz Baer, would later remark, "They came from nowhere. Silver, blinding, and fast as thought itself." The Luftwaffe's hunters had become the hunted. What stunned them most was not just performance, but discipline. American pilots no longer strayed far from the bomber formations. Instead, they worked in pairs and flights, weaving above and below the columns in layered protection. When German fighters tried to climb in from the rear, Mustangs were already there waiting, silent, invisible until they struck. From that point on, the air over Europe began to tilt toward Allied control. In less than a month, the Luftwaffe lost nearly one-third of its operational fighters. For every Mustang downed, several German aircraft burned in the fields below. The statistics told one story, but the morale told another. Veteran German pilots began describing the sky itself as betraying them. The sun, once their greatest ally in surprise attacks, now blinded them as the Americans used it to vanish and strike from impossible angles. The Mustangs seemed to climb into the light, one pilot said, as if no limit bound them. In reality, that was part of Allied training. To use the sun as cover, to strike from brilliance and disappear again into glare. It was psychological warfare executed through physics. The sound of the Merlin engine became a new kind of omen, smoother than the throaty growl of German Daimler-Benz engines, with a whistle that carried through clouds like an approaching storm. Soldiers on the ground could distinguish it instantly. To Allied troops, it meant protection. To German units, it meant exposure. By spring, even civilians could recognize the new silhouette in the sky. Long fuselage, bubble canopy, low-mounted wings gleaming like liquid steel. Newspapers in Berlin avoided naming it directly, calling it simply the enemy's long-winged fighter. But every pilot knew its name. The Americans had found the perfect balance of science and spirit, an aircraft that embodied both engineering precision and the will to endure. In the months that followed, the Mustang would escort bombers to Berlin, to Vienna, to the oil fields of Romania. It would clear the skies for D-Day and cripple the Luftwaffe so completely that Germany's greatest defense, its air superiority, would never recover. To the men who flew against it, the P-51 was more than a machine. It was a message. That technology, when paired with resolve, could break even the most disciplined opponent. And for many German pilots, that realization began not with defeat in battle, but with the blinding glare of dawn, when they first saw Mustangs climb straight into the sun, defying both gravity and expectation. Every war reveals more than destruction. It exposes contrasts, in technology, in courage, in belief. And nowhere was that contrast sharper than between the weary Luftwaffe pilots of 1944 and the fresh American aviators who now filled the European skies. To the German pilots, war in the air had once carried a kind of romantic code, a test of nerve, skill, and individual mastery. The early Luftwaffe aces had grown up on stories of the Great War's Knights of the Air. They believed in duels, in measured turns, in the art of outmaneuvering an opponent face to face. But by 1944, that chivalric illusion was gone. What now filled the heavens was industry-made flesh, assembly lines translated into horsepower, strategy into altitude, and engineering into dominance. The human angle. Inside a Luftwaffe dispersal hut, pilots waited for their briefing. Cigarettes trembling between fingers, boots crunching frost. Most were boys barely 20, flying on instinct and luck. Each had watched friends fail to return. Each had stared at the empty chairs of their mess halls. The attrition rate was unspeakable. Replacements arrived without proper training. Across the channel, their American counterparts were different. They were volunteers, many barely out of high school, trained under a system that valued team coordination above heroics. They were told not to chase glory, but to protect bombers. They were taught discipline over instinct. When they took to the air, it wasn't with the desperation of defending a homeland, but the determination of enforcing an ideal. The belief that through precision and cooperation, chaos could be controlled. That difference in mentality shaped the war above Europe. The tactical angle. For years, the Luftwaffe had relied on short, lethal bursts of combat. Strike fast, retreat faster. Their aircraft were optimized for speed and climb in short engagements. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190 were magnificent machines, agile, responsive, deadly in a dive. But they were built for proximity, not endurance. The Americans rewrote that logic. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just faster, it was patient. It could loiter over targets for hours, shepherding bombers home. Its drop tanks extended its reach deep into enemy airspace, where German fighters couldn't follow without running dry. And once the Mustangs stripped away the Luftwaffe's high-altitude ambushes, Germany's last strategic advantage evaporated. For the first time, the hunters of Europe's sky found themselves cornered by mathematics. Each raid that reached deeper into Germany cost them fuel, aircraft, and pilots that couldn't be replaced. Meanwhile, American production only increased. Every destroyed P-51 was replaced by another within days. Every fallen pilot was succeeded by 3 more ready to take his place. The technological angle. The true brilliance of the P-51 was not just its engine, it was its philosophy. North American aviation engineers led by Edgar Schmood had designed it for aerodynamic purity. Its laminar flow wing delayed drag, allowing it to slice the air with minimal resistance. Combined with the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it delivered power and efficiency in perfect balance. At cruising speed, it could reach nearly 440 miles per hour. It carried 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, enough to tear through any aircraft then flying. Yet it remained remarkably stable, even under stress. What that meant in combat was profound. German fighters were designed for quick thrusts. They climbed fast, but overheated easily. The Mustang could sustain a climb for minutes without stalling, pushing past where Messerschmitt engines began to choke. And perhaps most symbolically, its bubble canopy offered a near 360-degree view of the world. Pilots spoke of feeling as if the sky itself had opened. In a war defined by confinement, bunkers, trenches, blackout cities, the P-51 represented openness, perspective, freedom. To those fighting beneath its wings, it was a machine that could see beyond fear. The psychological angle for German pilots, that openness was terrifying. The Mustang seemed untouchable, uncatchable, as if it belonged to another generation of warfare entirely. There are accounts of Luftwaffe men who, after surviving an engagement, would sit silently in their cockpits long after landing, engines cooling, unable to comprehend what they'd faced. They had fought enemies before, Soviets, British, Americans, but never something that made them feel so out of time. To them, the Mustang was not simply an aircraft, it was a messenger, a signal that the future had arrived, sleek, efficient, and mercilessly modern. Every pilot who saw one climbing into the sun knew it instinctively. The war was no longer being fought on equal terms. By the spring of 1944, Luftwaffe morale had begun to collapse faster than its formations. The airmen still fought, bravely, often to the last bullet, but the belief that they could win had evaporated, and as the bombers rolled deeper into German skies with their little friends guarding every wingtip, the last fragments of German air superiority dissolved into sunlight. By early 1944, the battle for the skies over Europe had ceased to be a mere contest of machines. It had become a moral and ideological struggle, one that mirrored the broader war below. Every formation of bombers crossing into German airspace carried more than explosives. It carried the weight of democracy's industrial will. And every P-51 Mustang that rose to meet the Luftwaffe carried a quiet message: that freedom could be engineered, mass-produced, and flown straight into tyranny's heart. The leadership angle. At the highest levels of command, both sides understood what was at stake. In Berlin, Hermann Göring, once so confident of his air arm's supremacy, began to issue desperate orders. He demanded his remaining aces intercept the bombers at all costs, no matter the losses. But the skies no longer obeyed him. Allied radar coverage, superior fuel logistics, and disciplined escort formations made his command sound almost ceremonial. Echoes of authority spoken into an empty sky. Across the Channel, American generals such as Carl Spaatz and James Doolittle implemented a new doctrine. Seek and destroy the Luftwaffe in the air, not merely protect the bombers. Air superiority first, victory everywhere else follows, Doolittle wrote. The Mustangs were his instrument. He freed them from tight escort duty, ordering pilots to strike German fighters wherever they found them. Airfields, climb zones, even while taxiing for takeoff. It was ruthless efficiency wrapped in precision. This shift gutted the Luftwaffe's initiative. German commanders were forced into reactive defense, losing choice and tempo, the two things their early campaigns had always relied upon. The moral angle. Yet beneath the statistics and orders lay something more human. The American airmen, many barely 20, carried in their cockpits photographs of families, baseball teams, and sweethearts waiting in towns they could scarcely imagine seeing again. To them, the mission was not conquest, but duty, the sense that every flight chipped away at the machinery of oppression that had engulfed Europe. For the Germans, it was a different burden. Many were not zealots, but conscripts of circumstance, sons of teachers, farmers, and clerks, trapped in an empire unraveling from the inside. They fought for survival, not for ideology. And yet, every time they faced the shimmering silver Mustangs, they were reminded that the world beyond the Reich had not fallen into ruin. One captured Luftwaffe pilot later confessed to an American interrogator, "When I saw them climb so easily, I thought, perhaps they fight for something lighter than duty. Perhaps they fight because they believe." The ideological angle. That belief was the invisible weapon in the Mustang's arsenal. It embodied not just aeronautical excellence, but the American concept of boundless possibility. To a nation that had once been an ocean away from war, it proved that innovation could leap distances, ideology could not. Germany had engineered magnificent aircraft, the Me-262 jet, the FW-190, the Ta-152, yet they were few, restricted by fuel, production, and time. The Allies, by contrast, built on abundance. The Mustang was democracy streamlined into aluminum, designed quickly, improved collaboratively, built in thousands. It was not the genius of one man, but the combined intellect of a free system. In that it mirrored the greater conflict. Dictatorships centralize brilliance but strangle adaptability. Democracies disperse it, allowing resilience. The Mustang soared because the system that created it could evolve faster than fear. The symbolic angle. And so the Mustang became more than a weapon. It became a symbol. To the bombers below, its polished wings reflected sunlight like a promise. To soldiers on the ground, its roar meant hope. And to the enemy pilots who glimpsed it climbing, it represented inevitability. The recurring symbol of that age, sunlight, appeared in every pilot's memory. The Germans had used the sun for ambush since 1939. Now Americans used it for deliverance. When the Mustangs climbed into the glare, it was as if light itself had changed allegiance. Every engagement that began in brilliance ended in realization. The Reich's dominion over the air was burning away, like frost before morning. In diaries recovered after the war, Luftwaffe survivors wrote of their shock not at defeat, but at the manner of it. Clinical, precise, unstoppable. They fought with silence, one recorded. No shouting, no rage, only focus. That silence was the hum of modern warfare, efficiency devoid of hate. It marked the turning point from passion to process, from ideology to implementation. By the time spring ripened into summer, the skies over Europe belonged to the P-51. Every mission it flew widened the corridor through which D-Day would soon pour. And though many Mustangs fell, the legacy they carried never did. When the Luftwaffe finally collapsed under its own exhaustion, those who survived understood something their leaders did not. That supremacy in war no longer came from numbers or slogans, but from the quiet perfection of coordinated minds. The Mustang had proved that freedom could outclimb fear. February 21st, 1944, the second day of what Allied planners called Operation Argument, and what history would remember as Big Week. Before dawn, the airfields of East Anglia trembled beneath the low thunder of radial engines. Rows of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators lined the frost-dusted runways, their wings silver with ice, their bomb bays heavy with the promise of destruction. Crews checked maps by flashlight, drinking coffee gone cold. On a signal flare, propellers blurred into motion. Hundreds of aircraft lifted into the bruised morning sky, a fleet of shadows rising toward occupied Europe. Among them flew the New Guardians, P-51 Mustangs of the 4th and 357th Fighter Groups. Their long noses gleamed with the faint reflection of sunrise, drop tanks fitted, guns armed, radios crackling with call signs and coordinates. They would escort the bombers deep into the Reich, beyond Hanover, beyond Leipzig, into the heart of the German industrial belt. It was a mission the Luftwaffe could not ignore. At an airfield near Braunschweig, German pilots of Jagdgeschwader 11 gathered around a makeshift operations table. The room smelled of oil, damp wool, and fear. They knew what was coming. Radar plots had already traced the massive Allied formations crossing the North Sea. Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Moritz pointed to a map littered with red pins. Intercept over Brunswick sector, altitude 20,000. Standard dive, break formation, climb again. Outside, mechanics shouted over engines. The morning air bit like glass. One by one, the Messerschmitts rolled out, their tails painted with the Black Cross, their pilots strapped in by trembling hands. At 9:20 a.m., the two forces met over the fields of Lower Saxony. From below, farmers looked up to see streaks carving the sky, vapor trails twisting like white scars across a field of blue. Bombers droned in tight box formations, each a fortress of spinning turrets. The Germans rose to meet them, their climb steep, their timing perfect. And then something unexpected happened. Out of the glare above the bomber stream, the new escorts appeared. Mustangs climbing almost vertically, engines howling as they cut through sunlight. To the Germans below, they seemed to rise out of the sun itself. 1 second, the sky was empty. The next, it was alive with silver shapes, too fast to track, too coordinated to scatter. Major Friedrich Karl Miller, an ace with over 60 victories, later wrote, "They came from nowhere. The sun hid them until they were already upon us. Our formation broke before the first shots were fired." The first bursts of gunfire were precise, measured. Short flashes of tracers rather than wild sprays. Messerschmitts rolled and banked desperately, but the Mustangs stayed glued to their tails, matching every turn. The Merlin engine screamed with the sharp metallic pitch of victory. Within minutes, the carefully planned German interception dissolved into chaos. Smoke trails spiraled downward. Parachutes bloomed like white flowers against the black plumes of burning aircraft. The radio bands filled with static and disbelief. "Who are they?" one voice crackled. "They're Mustangs," another answered, tone hollow. Down below, an American gunner aboard a B-17 called out over the intercom, "They're here, the little friends." The relief in his voice was unmistakable. For the first time in months, bomber crews would not die alone. From his cockpit, Captain Don Gentile of the 336th Fighter Squadron banked hard into the rising sun, his wingtips skimming a contrail. He dove straight through a German formation, engines roaring, guns flashing. 2 Messerschmitts fell in flames before his flight regrouped and climbed again, not away from the fight, but back into the light. Observers on the ground described the spectacle as surreal, a dance of silver and fire where sunlight itself seemed to bend around the new American fighters. German anti-aircraft crews could scarcely tell friend from foe. The sky had become a blinding theater of defeat. By 10:15, the Luftwaffe's local command had lost contact with nearly half the intercepting squadron. The survivors limped home, some gliding, some crash landing in open fields. Fuel tanks were riddled, engines smoked. Yet the Mustangs kept circling high above, guardians of the bomber stream, their silhouettes barely visible against the noon glare. When the B-17s finally turned back westward, the sky behind them was littered with wreckage. More than 80 German fighters were lost that morning alone. It wasn't just a tactical defeat, it was a psychological collapse. The Luftwaffe's pilots, long accustomed to being predators, had become prey. Their greatest advantage, altitude, had been stolen by an enemy who could climb faster, stay longer, and strike harder. One survivor, Lieutenant Erich Heinze, would later recall, "We used to own the sun. That day they took it from us." And with that theft, the balance of the air war in Europe tipped irreversibly. The day's reports reached Goering by evening. When told that the new American fighters had followed the bombers all the way to Leipzig and back, he paused, staring at his aides. Then, with quiet disbelief, he muttered, "That means we have lost the war." He was not wrong. The days that followed would confirm what February 21st had revealed. The Mustang was not a miracle. It was the culmination of every lesson the Allies had learned through suffering. Big Week continued for 5 more days, and with each sunrise, Germany's air arm bled a little more. On February 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, the formations came again. Bombers in their hundreds, escorted by the same shining phantoms that seemed to climb straight out of the sun. Luftwaffe bases scrambled what remained of their forces, but coordination was collapsing. Communications were jammed, fuel reserves were critical, and experienced leaders were dying faster than they could be replaced. To the Americans, every sortie was a test of endurance. To the Germans, it was a lesson in inevitability. At the height of one engagement near Gotha, the 354th Fighter Group found itself facing over 40 Focke-Wulfs. The Germans dived in waves, determined to break the escort barrier and reach the bombers. But the Mustangs did not yield. They rolled, climbed, and counter-dived with a precision that felt choreographed. Each maneuver was practiced restraint. Aggression guided by mathematics. Captain James Goodson, a Mustang pilot, later recalled, "We didn't chase them anymore. We waited for them to fall." The Germans fell faster than anyone could have predicted. By the end of Big Week, more than 600 German aircraft had been destroyed, not in bombing raids, but in aerial combat. The Luftwaffe's pilot corps, once the elite of Europe, was fractured beyond repair. Their fuel lines were bombed, their factories hit, their morale spent. In their place rose a new image of air power, industrial, methodical, and unstoppable. The Mustang squadrons had changed more than tactics, they had changed perception. Allied crews now flew with confidence that bordered on reverence. They no longer felt hunted. Instead, they owned the sky. When the shimmering contrails of Mustangs appeared above them, even the deafening roar of engines seemed softer, replaced by something like faith. Among German ranks, the psychological toll was devastating. Reports from the Reich Air Ministry describe pilots refusing to engage unless absolutely necessary. Training programs shortened from months to weeks. Replacements arrived half prepared, their first missions often their last. The skies over Germany became both cradle and coffin. One Luftwaffe field report from March 1944 read simply, "Enemy escort fighters now accompany bombers from takeoff to target and return. We cannot engage without unacceptable losses. Morale, critical." The word critical was an understatement. By April, the Luftwaffe's leadership tried to shift tactics, deploying their best squadrons closer to key cities, relying on radar-guided ambushes. But the Mustangs adapted faster than the strategy could form. They swept ahead of the bomber streams, patrolling airfields and intercepting fighters before they could even climb. That was perhaps the most profound change. Control through anticipation. Where once German interceptors dictated the terms of combat, now the Americans dictated the rhythm of the war itself. For every Messerschmitt that took off, a Mustang was waiting, silent, unseen, until the moment it struck. To the ground troops below, these dogfights were streaks of light and vapor, often invisible except for their consequences. A plume of smoke in the distance, the echo of a crash. But for those in the air, it was revelation. One German ace, Walter Schuck, later said, "You could feel it. The balance had gone. No matter how skilled you were, they always seemed one step ahead." What the Luftwaffe had once achieved through instinct and innovation, the Allies now achieved through systems. Radar coordination, production consistency, pilot rotation, logistical precision. The Mustang was not just faster, it was sustained by an empire of supply and organization the Axis could never match. On the final day of Big Week, February 25th, American bombers reached Regensburg under full escort and returned with minimal losses. The mission logs were clinical, almost detached. The emotion was not triumph, it was relief. Relief that the strategy worked. Relief that the tide had turned. In the Reich Chancellery, reports arrived like funeral bells. Goering's staff spoke in euphemisms. Attrition, redeployment, strategic recalibration. But those words could not disguise the truth. The Luftwaffe's backbone, its fighter arm, was broken. And as spring thawed into summer, the impact of those February days rippled outward. The Allied invasion of Normandy, once unthinkable without control of the air, now had clear skies. The Mustang, designed in peacetime optimism, had become the spearhead of liberation. Its shadow fell over rail yards, convoys, and retreating columns. It escorted bombers to Berlin, strafed tanks in Normandy, and hunted Me-262 jets on takeoff. Wherever it flew, the message was the same. The world had changed direction. By the time Germany's final surrender came in May 1945, many of those who had once fought against the Mustang were prisoners, weary, thin, and silent. They had learned a lesson written not in ideology or strategy, but in the light above them, that once the sun belonged to another, darkness could no longer win. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was no longer a shield but a shadow. What had begun as scattered defeats during Big Week matured into a total collapse of Germany's ability to control its own skies. In the months that followed, the numbers told a story too stark for even propaganda to conceal. Between February and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 2,200 fighters, and more devastatingly, the men who flew them. Each experienced ace who fell represented hundreds of flight hours, thousands of gallons of irreplaceable fuel, and years of training the Reich could no longer afford. The Luftwaffe's replacement system, once admired for its rigor, had become a desperate assembly line. Young men, barely trained, were thrown into cockpits and sent into the sky against pilots with hundreds of hours in combat. Many never returned from their first mission. Meanwhile, American production surged to levels the Axis could not even imagine. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States produced more than 15,000 P-51 Mustangs, each assembled, tested, and delivered with industrial precision. Factories in California and Texas ran day and night. Crates of wings and engines crossed the Atlantic faster than the Reich could build its next batch of Messerschmitts. The skies became an ocean of inevitability. The Allies now flew where they wished, when they wished. Bombers no longer flinched at the sight of enemy fighters. They flew confidently in broad daylight, escorted to their targets by squadrons of Mustangs sweeping ahead like silver knives. Every vital artery of the German war machine, its oil fields, rail networks, and industrial cities, lay exposed. The Mustang's endurance made it more than an escort. It became a hunter. American pilots strafed airfields, locomotives, and convoys deep inside the Reich, severing the supply veins that had kept its armies alive. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. Jet prototypes like the Me-262 and rocket-powered interceptors appeared on runways, promising a technological miracle. But miracles need time, and time was a luxury that Germany no longer possessed. Even when those new machines did take to the air, they were met by Mustangs waiting at low altitude, engines idling, patient as sentinels. The first jet losses of the war were not to flak or failure, but to the guns of P-51s catching them vulnerable on takeoff. The psychological gulf widened. By mid-1944, many German pilots described the sky itself as unfriendly. The sense of home field advantage was gone. The very air that had once been theirs now punished them for rising into it. A captured Luftwaffe report from that summer summarized the crisis in one bleak line. Enemy air forces now possess complete freedom of action. We are blind in daylight. That blindness spread downward. German civilians who once watched their airmen depart with pride now watched firestorms bloom over their cities. The hum of the Merlin engine, that smooth, unwavering note of American power, became a prelude to ruin. For the Allies, air dominance transformed every campaign that followed. In Normandy, the D-Day invasion succeeded partly because the Luftwaffe could not even appear. Allied soldiers marched under clear skies while Mustangs prowled above, ensuring no German column moved unpunished. By the end of that summer, it was clear. The air war in Europe was no longer a contest of courage, but of capacity. And in that contest, the United States had already won. The Mustang had not just ended the Luftwaffe's reign. It had rewritten the very laws of aerial warfare. Range, endurance, and teamwork had replaced raw aggression as the measure of mastery. The men who once feared climbing into daylight now soared with confidence. The balance of fear had shifted permanently toward those who fought beneath the sun. When the echoes of Big Week faded, the war in the air had already entered its final act. The Luftwaffe still existed on paper, squadrons, bases, and commanders. But in reality, it was a wounded organism kept alive by inertia. For every new pilot who climbed into a cockpit, another 3 never came back. The Americans, on the other hand, had entered an age of confidence. Pilots who had once trained in the deserts of California now flew over Europe with a sense of calm precision. They were not reckless, they were efficient. Every mission was another step toward ending the war. The Mustang had made that transformation possible. Its design, elegant and utilitarian, became the defining shape of Allied power. Photographs of P-51s flying wingtip to wingtip over the English countryside became wartime icons, appearing in newspapers and recruitment posters. To the soldiers who fought below, its polished wings reflected reassurance. When the sun caught its metal skin just right, it looked less like a machine and more like the physical embodiment of hope. For many German pilots, the transition from dominance to defeat was deeply personal. Captured airmen spoke with a kind of detached awe about the Mustangs. They appeared so fast, one remembered, we would see the sunlight first, a flash, then feel the bullets. Another pilot, who had survived dozens of sorties over Russia but was shot down by a Mustang over Cologne, said quietly, "I never feared death until that day. It was like fighting the future." Post-war interviews revealed something remarkable, a grudging respect. Despite the hatred bred by years of conflict, many Luftwaffe veterans admitted admiration for their American counterparts. The Mustangs were not seen as cruel machines, but as expressions of a different kind of strength, technical, disciplined, impersonal. Major Erich Hartmann, the most successful fighter ace in history, once said, "The P-51 was the finest opponent I ever faced. It had no weaknesses, only advantages." The Americans, too, carried memories etched in engine noise and sunlight. When the war ended, many Mustang pilots returned home quietly, trading the sound of their Merlins for the hum of civilian life. Some never spoke of what they had seen, of the formations that never returned, of the smoke trails that marked a friend's last descent. But even in silence, they knew. They had flown in a moment when history turned beneath their wings. After the war, the P-51 remained in service across the globe, in Korea, in Israel, in Latin America, wherever the ideals of freedom and modernity sought form in metal. Its longevity spoke to more than engineering. It spoke to endurance of principle. The United States, now a superpower, carried forward the lesson of the Mustang, that mastery of the air was mastery of the modern world. For Germany, the post-war years brought reflection. The Luftwaffe was disbanded, its surviving pilots scattered into civilian lives. Some became instructors, others never flew again. The skies they had once ruled became symbols of loss and, paradoxically, of peace. In memoirs written decades later, a few spoke of that winter morning in 1944 when they saw the Mustangs rise into the sun. "We thought we were watching planes," one wrote. We were watching an empire fade. The Mustang thus became both a weapon and a warning, proof that technological superiority, when guided by purpose and sustained by freedom, could overwhelm even the most disciplined enemy. Its roar was the sound of industry made righteous, and its shadow stretched beyond victory, across generations of flight that would follow. By the time the war's final days came in 1945, the world had learned to look up and measure power not by flags or slogans, but by who held the sky. And in that sky, gleaming under the unbroken light of the same sun that once hid its climb, the Mustang still flew. In every war, there comes a moment when technology and conviction align so perfectly that they transcend mere machinery. The Mustang was that moment. It was born not from desperation, but from design, from the quiet belief that speed, endurance, and vision could alter destiny. When those silver wings lifted above the English countryside, they carried more than ammunition. They carried a philosophy, that freedom, once given form, could climb higher than tyranny could ever reach. The German pilots who watched them rise into the glare of morning were witnessing more than defeat. They were seeing a transformation, of warfare, of belief, of the very meaning of power. For years they had ruled the skies through precision and fear. Now the sky itself seemed to turn against them, surrendering its brilliance to those who fought not for conquest, but for endurance. The Mustang's ascent into the sun became an unspoken metaphor for the century that followed. It represented the dawn of modern warfare, swift, global, mechanized, but it also symbolized the light that emerges when ingenuity meets moral clarity. Long after the last sortie was flown, after the airfields fell silent and the world began to rebuild, the image endured. A plane climbing into light, defying gravity and expectation alike. Every whisper of its Merlin engine carried the echo of that belief. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to rise despite it. In the decades that followed, pilots of every nation would look to the P-51 not just as an aircraft, but as a compass, a reminder that the human spirit, like the machine that once pierced the clouds, was built to ascend. The war ended, the skies cleared, but somewhere in the quiet hum of history, the Mustang still climbs, straight into the sun, where freedom always begins its flight.